Good morning, and welcome to the SACAM filming of Stories of Students in Segregated Schools. We'd like to welcome everybody for being here today. We have an esteemed panel of guests who will be sharing their experiences with the educational system here in San Antonio and in other parts of Texas. You know, when we think about oral histories, they are important because they give us an opportunity to reflect on the memories and experiences from firsthand account of things that have happened in the lives of our community. We have an opportunity to capture unwritten history of not only the struggle, but also the resulting achievements. People who may not have otherwise written a book or taught a class now get to be heard. We also want to do these things so that we can gather and preserve the voices and the memories of a community and provide a resource for generations to come. So we want to thank, SACAM wants to thank the various partners that we have that are associated with this, that being Nowcast, the 100 Black Men, and the Van Cortlandt Foundation. We are excited to hear what has to be said, and we look forward to this grand event. And at this time, I will pass the microphone to our esteemed moderator.
I like that statement, esteemed moderator. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Leonard E. Lawrence. I am not a native San Antonian. I came here in 1969 through the United States Air Force, and I planned to leave as soon as I could. I was going to return to my home in Indianapolis, Indiana, go into private practice and get rich. I am a child psychiatrist and a general psychiatrist, and I figured the people in Indiana needed me more than the people in San Antonio. That was 52 years ago that I came here, and I am very pleased that I am still here and pleased with the opportunity to be a part of today's interaction. And I'm going to now ask each of the panelists individually to tell you who they are. Joan, you start.
I'll start. Good morning. My name is Joan Hartfield Duncan. I am a native San Antonian. I have been here all of my life. I grew up on the east side and attended CUNY, Washington elementary schools and Douglas Junior High School, and graduated as valedictorian of the class of 1957 from Phyllis Wheatley High School. I am just delighted to be here and to know that we are going to get some of the most interesting stories some of you have heard from this locality. Generally, Houston and Dallas are ahead of us, but thank goodness we have these wonderful scholars with us who have now brought our attention to what existed in San Antonio, Texas over the past decades.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much. My name is Samuel Scott, Jr., and I'm also a native San Antonian, born on the east side, what we used to call Denver Heights, and attended CUNY Elementary School. Douglas, at that time, they were called junior highs, and Phyllis Wheatley High School, class of 1961. I have a little cap here to give you an indication about Wheatley High School, founded in 1932. I was not in that class, but I did graduate in 1961. And from an established family on the east side, my father, S.T. Scott Sr., actually was principal at Douglas when I was there, and eventually became principal at Wheatley and then served on the San Antonio Independent School District Board. My mother was an elementary school teacher and taught at a number of schools around San Antonio and even outside San Antonio. So both my parents were educators. And like we both grew up on the east side in Denver Heights, and like to reflect back and think of it as a village. where everyone that lived in that community made a very big effort and to support the youth of the community. It was like one big family. And we were fortunate enough to have in that part of town a number of teachers that lived in the community, a few doctors, a lawyer, professionals. We had people that we could look up to and they could easily reach out to. And we got in trouble, they reached out to us. Because if we did something wrong, our parents would know it by the time we got home. And I think that's something I reflect back on now, and I'm not sure that situation exists in today's world, but I think we all benefited from that during our early years, and eager to talk more about that later on. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cook.
Good morning. My name is Lemuel Cook. I'm a native of San Antonio, born and raised. I went to Grant Elementary School on the west side, as well as Dunbar Middle School. Then I went on to Jefferson High School here in San Antonio. Upon my graduation, I went to college at Trinity University, graduated from there, played a little semi-pro football with the San Antonio Toro. I indulged in a lot of different capacities. Joan was a military veteran as well. And I'm a school teacher, like I say, for 46 years. And it's pretty much, I come from a large family of 7. It was 2 girls, 5 boys, and we were a close-knit family. And that's part of my livelihood itself much. But like I say, I taught at school for 41 years.
It's kind of interesting. We all attended, quote, segregated schools. What did that mean to each of you that you were attending a segregated academic system? And any one of you can start.
I will. You know, I can truly say that for me, it was a blessing. I realize that now. Because that particular part of my journey, I think is what gave me the confidence, the strength, the courage, even the knowledge that I might not have received had I been in an integrated school at that time. My teachers, I remember each and every one of them. And I cannot say that any one of them was what I would call a bad teacher. I mean, they taught you not only academics, but they taught you about life. Life skills were taught in the school. And schools and churches and families had the same value system. And so what I learned at home was strengthened by what I learned at school and what I learned at church. All of that going together, I don't think I would have become the confident, especially black woman, that I am today, had I not had that kind of support in my life. I look at young people today and wish for them, and I have taught for over 40 years in integrated schools. And I know that our children did not receive the support that I received.
When you entered that segregated school, what did you think you were about to embark upon? Segregated school.
That was, I'm being very honest with you to say I did not even factor that into my psyche.
Do you know why?
Why?
I'm asking you if you
I don't know.
why.
I mean, it was not part of, I'll go back again to a little bit of what I said yesterday. I think San Antonio had sort of a unique situation in that I did not know I was supposed to be disadvantaged or deprived of whatever. There were business owners, there were a ton of educators here, well-educated people. I want to really brag on them. most of the people that I knew, and I'm sure that Sam knew, were homeowners. And those who were in public housing were just temporary residents. They came in, up, and out. And everyone was on an upward bound trajectory, really.
Mr. Cook, what did entering a segregated school when you were 6, 7 years of age, what did that mean to you?
Well, it meant, like she was mentioning, it was like for a family situation. When you were in segregated school, the teachers were like your own parents. You know, what you learned at home and you got to school, it was actually the same thing as reinforced from what you were taught at home. So they were like family when we got to the school. I mean, they cared about you, they wanted you to excel, and that transformed throughout my life. So our teacher was like the parents to us, and we were always
We're really products
we
of
were
a
safe
real
at
village.
school because we knew that if we did something wrong,
That's right.
parents were gonna know about it.
Mr. Scott, did you ever go into downtown San Antonio before you started school?
Yes, I did, and I was just thinking back and reflecting. I agree with the nurturing aspect of the segregated schools, but we, at that time, when I was growing up in the city of San Antonio, you had opportunities to branch out to a certain extent. There were certain days of the year that we were allowed to go to the symphony. Other times, reflecting back on most recently on Juneteenth, was the one day of the year when we could go to Playland Park, which was the main amusement park in San Antonio. And that was the only day out of the year that blacks could go there. And we were just as happy as we could be. Our high school, Phyllis Wheatley High School, had very good athletic programs, as Mr. Cook will remember, and a good football team, but everything about high school football in Texas is weekend, Friday night. Phyllis Wheatley was given Wednesday night to play at Alamo Stadium, which was the stadium for the San Antonio Independent School District. And what high school plays in the middle of the week
Yes.
and has to go back to class the next 2 days? But Phyllis Wheatley did. And we were happy. The teams that were traveling to San Antonio didn't particularly like that, especially if they were coming from far away, like Houston and Austin and Waco and so forth, to come down in the middle of the week and have to go back. But these are things that I look back on, and I didn't think much about it at the time. I didn't realize that we were being subjected to some of the worst aspects of segregation. But we, at the same time, were moving forward and doing the best that we could under adverse circumstances. And I think that was the main thing that I look back on, is that even with those adversities, we were able to achieve and move on forward.
Allowed to go to Playland Park, allowed to go to a museum, allowed to interact briefly outside of the all-black community. What did that mean to each of you that you had to be allowed to do those things?
It was kind of like being restricted, not allowed to be, say, isolated. It made me feel like I was a prisoner in a sense. I can't go here, I can't go there. I must have permission to do this and permission to do that. We were not given that opportunity like others, but I had to learn to accept what was done and kind of grow on it. It just wasn't a good idea for situation.
When I lived in a little place called Seymour, Indiana, southern Indiana, halfway between Indianapolis and Louisville, black population was in one corner of the town. We were not allowed to go downtown only on Thursday evenings. Other than that, you could not, by your own volition, interact with non-black populations. Did you ever get frightened by the fact that if you made a mistake, you might be punished in some way?
You know, I think frightened is maybe not the exact word I would use, but I think there were certain instances when we felt that because of a certain incident or an exposure, you realize that you did not have the same type of facilities, the same type of resources that were available to other students in the community that attended white schools. But at that same time, I know my first experience was participating in the Babe Ruth League as a young baseball player. And it was really the first time I was the only black on the team. It was my first experience to interact with teammates. And they made a special effort to welcome me. And I was somewhat surprised because we kind of been insulated from that kind of thing growing up at an early age. But they were more than welcoming and, oh, come on, do this and do that. And you had to think about it as I reflect back on it. I think it was an attempt at being genuine. I don't think it was false, but it was a new experience for them, and at the same time it was a new experience for me. So I think we both recognized that there could be something that could come out of that was positive, that we both could benefit from. And I think those are the little steps that I remember taking away from a totally segregated situation in a neighborhood that was primarily African American and beginning to venture out. And you use the term where we were frightened or where we were afraid. I don't think so. I just think it was something different and new. And we had to kind of brace ourselves that it wasn't going to be something that would be embarrassing. And the more it turned out not to be that way, the more happy, the more satisfied we were.
Both sides. I think I thought of two incidents that made me more aware of what was going on. One was going over to Jefferson High School and realizing that they had scientific equipment, like every child had a microscope, whereas we had so many per table. Now, I do remember that. And the other thing that I think was my best experience, I guess I should say, with integration was through the Girl Scouts. I became a Girl Scout in second grade, and while it was a segregated system, as I was growing up, it became more and more integrated. And we had two separate camps. They had one that had cabins and whatever. We had tents. The final analysis was that we became better scouts because we had to have more survival skills than they did. So when the first National Girl Scout Roundup was convened, 2 black girls were part of the Alamo Patrol. And that was a very, very encouraging experience, I guess, in terms of how will you act? And we lived together for like 2 weeks in Michigan. And so.
Another point, since
Go ahead.
I
I know, I'm
listening to y'all's
finished.
conversation, we're talking about materials.
Yes,
We're not
Wheatley.
given updated materials. So for instance, textbooks. I remember the teacher saying we got our text, but we didn't get from the state that we're not providing the black schools when I was in junior high school with the updated textbooks that the other schools would have in the Anglo schools.
Right.
So when I got to, when I was at Dunbar, I remember a teacher mentioning it. We have hand-me-down books that we receive from the state, from Jefferson High School. Jefferson
Right.
High School would get new books, and
There
then
was-
the books were handed me down from those high schools, Anglo high school, and given to the black schools.
Right.
So we didn't ever have brand new,
And in
up-to-date
spite
books.
of, those teachers
That's right,
bridged that gap.
that's right.
Whatever was missing, they bridged the gap.
I think beyond just one point, beyond not just education in the schools, but other organizations such as you mentioned Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and the one that's very dear to me is the YMCA.
Yes, that's true.
David Scott, YMCA. Scott was S.T. Scott Sr. was my dad. And he made a special effort as an educator and also as a very dedicated supporter of the YMCA. And he traveled around and saw different YMCAs around the city. And he said, we have to do something on the east side because what we have was a very substandard facility on Commerce Street called Alamo Branch
Right,
YMCA. So Odie Davis, the other person it's named for, and my dad made a serious effort over many years to fundraise to support the establishment of a new facility that the east side of San Antonio could be proud of. And that was named for him, and about a week later, unfortunately, he passed away. But he was so proud of the fact that that facility was built and it had his name on it, and it was something that the east side community could be proud of. And so in addition to education and the school system, there are other elements that came into play in terms of segregation and inferior status that the black community had.
When I was in the year 1941, when I was 4 years of age, we lived in the projects in Indianapolis. And my mother took me into a department store. In that department store, there was a bin of stocking caps. 4-year-old kid reached up, picked up a stocking cap, and put it on. The manager was immediately there asking for payment. 4-year-old kid didn't know that if you were black and you tried something on, you just bought it. My mother just had enough money for us to ride the streetcar 26 blocks back to the projects. All the way back, 26 blocks walking. I'm going to whip you when we get home, boy. I'm going to whip you when we get home, boy. I prayed, Lord God, make her forget. We walked into our 4th floor apartment. And she immediately went to the bathroom, and that razor strap that hung on the back was in her hand. And pretty soon it was applied to different locations of me. And she would always ask me in mid-stroke, do you understand? Do you understand? And before I got a chance to say, yes, ma'am, whap, she got me again. She was encouraging survival. Whenever one of us ventured into a non-accepting, predominantly white community. Have any of you ever experienced being punished in order to keep you out of trouble in a non-segregated arena?
You mean being punished so that you would be prepared and know how to act in a non-segregated arena? Yeah, I don't know, punished is the right word. I think we were growing up, we were constantly made aware of the fact that if you are going into a non-segregated environment, you were going to be breaking the ice. You would be kind of cutting edge, and you knew that you were told that you were going to be expected to be better, to excel. My senior year at Wheatley, the summer of the senior year, I made a special effort to take 2 classes at Brackenridge, which was the white high school in reasonably in that part of town. And I was just surprised at how easy it was.
Yeah.
I mean, I was so prepared.
You were so prepared. That is.
And that was what, I made straight A's on every exam. I said, is this what the white school is all about? And I said, well, if it is, I know that my preparation over the last 11 years or so has been outstanding, because I didn't feel intimidated. I felt that I could achieve and I could excel as well or better than anyone else in that class. So I think that was reassuring for me. And it was something I had to do, just to prove a point. And I was happy with the way it turned out. So.
My freshman year at Trinity University, I think that's something that, everyone was. I'm sorry. At Is it on?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. At Trinity University, when we graduated, that was one of the schools that was offering really a very good scholarship, and I took advantage of it. I think that's probably like the state scholarships that you get for the valedictorian, but everyone was reminding me of how difficult that was going to be, breaking the ice at Trinity. But like Sam, I had that same, I was so well prepared. That's why I keep going back to those black teachers that I had, because when I did get into those areas with integration, I was not underprepared, in spite of the fact that we did not have everything that everyone else had had. I think that was.
I think it continued on beyond educational experiences as
Oh,
we
yes.
get into our careers. I'm a
Yes.
retired Foreign Service officer, and the State Department is probably one of the most
Yes.
non-integrated
Yes,
government entities that exist, and very small number of minorities. But again, you continuously throughout your life, you felt that you were prepared based on some of the foundational experiences that you'd had growing up, going back to segregated schools and having to make it with minimum resources. And that carried on to your lifestyle and your life experiences and your career. And I think it wound up positive for me. I mean, I was able to confront, no matter what situation, I'd say that I can make it because of some of the early childhood experiences that you had experienced and had to excel in with minimum resources.
I know some of the challenges that our teachers expose us to. The type of, in the black school, we had to learn how to think on our feet. You know, learning how to add, you know, without using paper and pencil. You know, you had to,
brain.
as an example, what's the way we say 2 plus 2 is simple, but, you know, like what's 15 times 15?
right.
So what you had to say, well, I know 5 times 5 is 25, and then 5 on one is this, and then coming out to 225, you could figure that out in your head. The
And you
teachers
could still
taught
do
you
that.
how to figure how to multiply in your head.
Yes.
When I got to high school, all that stuff that I was taught in middle school, I felt like a genius because they taught us really well
Exactly.
to be able to think on our feet.
I tell you.
And then I get to class and say, why aren't you opening up your book on certain situations? Why aren't you looking at your book? And I said, I've already learned that. You know, that's something I've already learned. And they said, well.
That transition from elementary school to high school is a very important time. Now, of the three of you, 2 of you were in all black high schools. Mr. Cook was in Jefferson High School, as I heard it, which was the elite
Very elite.
non-black school at that time.
Right.
You just described how your academic preparation and the commitment of your teachers in elementary school really prepared you for the battle, so to speak, that one sometimes confronts in the high school arena, especially in those days. For the 2 of you who went to predominantly black schools, was there any difference in the approach that your teachers in that transition process used from that Mr. Cook experienced?
Well, you know, I can't speak from his experience because I did not attend a predominantly white high school. But at the black junior high and high school, as we've said earlier, I think the key aspect that we both probably remember is, if you had to define it, I would define it in terms of nurturing. And understanding that the faculty had about what the student experiences were, not just in the classroom, but in the community, in the household. And that's something, I'm not sure if he experienced that at Jefferson. I would doubt that he did, where a teacher would understand what it's like to grow up in the black community. But if you had a teacher in high school who lived in that community, who also had children that grew up in that situation, beyond the X's and O's and the science and the academic aspect, you had a certain nurturing aspect that you knew you could go talk to that teacher. And that teacher would receive your conversation and receive the conversation in a way that made you feel better and probably made the teacher feel better.
Your families were very important in your preparation for the entire academic experience. What role did your families play in emphasizing your need to pay attention to your teachers, your need to be cooperative with your teachers, your need to follow their lead?
Well, my parents were quite strict. My parents never went to high school. My father was grade level of 3, and my mother was grade level 4. So they were strict on education, learning. I had older brothers and sisters, like I was the 6th child, so a lot of the educational part came from my older siblings. They were like parents because they were, like I said, they were a lot older than I was. So to keep me up to date with education and to do well, that was my older siblings that kept us in mind, because my parents, like I say, never went through, graduated from elementary school. They were laborers, had to go out and do work, so they take care of the family. But like my older brother siblings, they were actually my parents helping me with my education. Discipline, yeah, the parents took care of that. That was no problem. They made sure that you did the right thing, said the right thing, and respect others. So it was a combination of both, parents as well as my older siblings.
I think in the African American community, you see that's one side of the story. Then you see the other side. My parents were educated, both of them, but it's a generational thing. I think my father's father and my mother's parents were not. And the emphasis that my grandparents placed on education, and I didn't know them, but I heard the stories that my parents were told that because they didn't have those benefits and that education, they are going to get it. And I think the same thing happens now with those of us in this generation. We all want our kids and our grandkids to achieve and to have a better life than we have. I mean, that's just human nature. And I think that's what happened. A lot of the grandparents in our generation and great-grandparents came from small towns and managed their way to get to the city. But what they had experienced, each generation wants better for their children. And I think that's what happens, and it's inevitable. It happens. You talk back and you look historically at like the previous generations that did not have education. They focused on making sure that their kids did. And my generation, I'm focusing on the same thing with my kids and my grandkids. So it kind of perpetuates itself. It goes on from generation to generation that you do want your offspring to have better than you had, if possible. And you make every effort to do that. You have to provide it.
And my family, my father's side of the family, were landowners, and that they emphasized work and buying land. But on my mother's side, my great-grandfather, Singletary, and his wife were both in education. The first school for colored children, I think that's what they called it, was the Phillips School in Guadalupe County in an area, a community known as Sweet Home, which still exists. And it was the Phillips family that started a school for colored children. And then in 1921, I think it was, that Guadalupe County received notice of the Sears Roebuck grants that were being provided to communities to establish schools. And one of those grants was given to my great-grandfather, Henry James Singletary. The community would raise half of the money and the grant would provide the remainder. That building itself still exists in Sweet Home community. It is now a senior citizens service center. But he built that school it was a 4-room building. and they emphasized home economics and agriculture in the higher grades and in the lower grades. And my mother taught there, and maybe 3 or 4 of her cousins and whatever. So I agree with Sam about generational. I never had to think about whether or not I was going to go to college. The family had already made that, you don't have a choice. It's not when, if, it's when.
What role did religion or faith play in the development of each of you?
Mine was number 1. My mantra is God, family, education. That's the way it goes.
I think so. Also, during our growing up days, we all of us had a very close relationship with our church, our pastor, and it's interesting that those churches, although there have been many demographic changes and shifts away from what was formerly the East Side, what the mainstay seems to be the church.
Yes.
And people come from all over to attend those same churches that continue to exist and serve a role in the community. So I think the relationship that our families had with a pastor or the church or the choir, or in some aspect, if they were serving on the church as a deacon or in some other capacity at the church, there was always a strong bond and a connection with the church. And we were told, I mean, there wasn't any question about it, you had to go to church on Sunday.
Yes.
And that was just a part of the routine. And you went to Sunday school and you did whatever you were supposed to do to maintain your religious connection in the community.
Yeah, religion had a lot to do with my education, because I can remember the time my parents would say, "Boy, get up! You going to Sunday school? You going to church? If you had to walk or you had to ride with somebody." But like you said, church was number 1 priority. You learn in church and carry that on to your schooling as well. So
Exactly.
yeah.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned, Mr. Cook. You said one of the things you learned was how to think things through. Was there one course, one subject area that was most important in facilitating your capacity to think things through?
The math class, I mean, the part about math and spelling. Spelling was another a big deal. We had like contests the teacher would get all of us up, stand up, boys on one side, girls on the other side, boys against the girls. And we're going to find who's the best speller. Same thing we were doing with the math. And that were words that, if the teacher gave us a list of words, go home and study. That's another meaning that you had to go home and do some homework. Learn how to spell the words properly and then be able to pronounce them. So we had the different type games that we played, whether it was spelling or whether it was math or what other subject matter, or even history. So we had to learn how to think on our feet, like I mentioned before, with all different subject areas. So that made me a better student, because when I got to high school, like I said, I was an honor student, so it kind of helped me. And then I want to make my West Side proud that, here I am, a black student, going to an all-white school, and they're going to be looking at me. But I want also them to look at me also. I want to let them know that I was just as well educated as they were. So that was a plus that I brought back to my community. I did well.
No, I'm just thinking back, reflecting. High school, there was, in those days we called it civics. An instructor I had, whose name was Mr. Warren.
Oh, civics.
Yes, government, civics. And
Government.
I can remember vividly, he was impeccably dressed. He never came to class not dressed in a suit and tie. And those things, you reflect back on. I said, well, maybe I wound up in government, and I wound up interested in some of the civil aspects of what's going on. But I remember Mr. Warren saying, when he started the class, he says, you will listen, you will pay attention, and we're going to do this, and we're going to, very meticulous, very regimented, but what I remember most was the way he was dressed. And I think those things stick with you. You respected him because he presented to the class an image that we could be proud of. We could be proud of the way he was dressed, the way he presented himself to the students. And that's what really, those kinds of things stay with you. And I remember him until he was, and plus he was a neighbor. He lived 2 blocks up the street.
Yeah, plus, that's right.
And he said, come by the house. If you don't understand something, I'll talk to you more about it. But he came to class dressed impeccably. and I just remember that. It's a memory I have, and I can close my eyes right now and reflect and see him in the classroom.
The reason I asked the question that way, I went to an all-black elementary school, but with white teachers.
Oh.
I went to a Catholic school. And the reason I went into the Catholic school is because the public school in the projects, well, right across the hall from our apartment, there were a set of twins who were a year older than me, and they had flunked the first grade in the public school. And because of the complaints of their mother that she would share with my mother said, well, you know, maybe we got to find someplace else for this boy to go to school. You know, my mother didn't finish high school until after I got into grade school, and my father had an 8th grade education, so, you know, they weren't college trained or anything. And so there was this daycare place that I went, and they asked people about the daycare place at where I ought to go to school, and they said, well, we don't know much about them Catholics, but that Catholic school across the street seems to do okay with their students. So $15 a month, chauffeur, and a maid's salary. I don't know where they got the money, but they put me in that school. Well, the reason I remember that, the one thing that I learned in that school, and it relates directly to what you were saying, Mr. Cook, I learned how to use the English language. I dissected more sentences. I went through more routine activity to learn the spelling, to learn the pronunciation. Now, what I didn't realize at 8, 9 years of age, that what the nuns there were focusing on was trying to prepare black young men to become priests and black young women to become nuns. That was their ulterior motive. They had one. But in grade school, I didn't realize that. I just knew that they stayed on my case about learning how to use the English language. Well, as a result, I'm a darn good public speaker at this point in my life, if you will. I can think things through. I can process things through. And so the idea of picking up skills at that early stage within the academic environment is extremely valid. So many of our kids nowadays don't have that commitment, either from teachers or from community or from within the family. So do any of you have ideas about how we can approach that deficit within our youth in today's society? You have done any thinking about that?
Well, I just retired in 2020, so I've just come out of that environment. And one of the things that I think, I don't know if we would have to form groups of individuals at churches or at the Y or wherever, but our children, and not only our children, American students, are just really missing out on. We're trying to teach what is now called a block or process called critical thinking skills, which uses a taxonomy by a person called Bloom's taxonomy. Tells you need to learn how to evaluate, how to analyze, how to break down materials, and how to know how to tell when something is right or wrong. To go to law school, you need to be able to evaluate. So they don't take that seriously. It is too, structured. It doesn't bring about any pleasure, and no one is rewarding them if they do that. Do you notice how much more attention the bad kids get now than those who are achieving? We give all of the attention to the bad kids. So some of our good kids want to be bad kids so they can get that attention. So we need some way to, I know we don't want to go backward, but there are some of the things that we know bring about success, but our children don't see that. They don't know that. We knew that. We knew that going to college would give us a better chance at a better job or whatever. But we can't say that to them now, because some of those same kids will come up and say, oh no, I run drugs for my uncle and he makes so much and so much a year, you see? So it's a systemic problem. And it's not just black kids, and it's not just poor children. Many of our more successful families have suffered that kind of deficit now. So when you ask about what can you do, schools are trying, but I think we haven't seen the forest for the trees.
It's a dilemma.
It is a dilemma.
When I first came to San Antonio, I was invited to become a member of the KLRN board, and I refused. And the reason I refused is because it was my opinion, based on all of my experiences in growing up and my formal training, that television had one of the worst impacts on child development that any entity or any factor could ever have. By the way, I still believe that. It's even worse today because of the social media. Mm-hmm. It's worse today because we spend more time in the non-factual, opinion-oriented product and activity. Mm-hmm. And our kids are directly exposed to that. There may not be an approach other than constantly saying it publicly, over and over, getting repetitive. But I wonder what you all think about what I just said relative to our role as senior African Americans in participating in a new learning process for our youth that focuses on fact as opposed to fantasy.
I still think they're going to have to see it. We're going to have to be examples of, and I'm just thinking of the four of us who are sitting here now. In any average school here in the city, how many of those kids have been exposed to us?
See, it's interesting that you say that. I spent about an hour on the telephone last night with an 18-year-old youngster who is now entering college, and he and I talked about his career. Mm-hmm. We talked about how to figure out what he might be interested in. Mm-hmm. I didn't tell him what to study, but I made myself, if you will, available that he can call me at any time, and I can call him at any time to talk about his progress. That one-on-one is something that occurred community on us as we were growing up. And it was a lot of one-on-one that was shared, if you will, by other community members Can we get back to that in some way?
Mentorships they work if you can get them going and keep them going. We have a lot of them that do startups, but they're not long-term. We need some long haulers like that. And you're also going to have to somehow, some way, get parents involved with their children's education. Right now, our parents are not involved with their children's education. They bring the child to you and say, I can't do anything. I brought him so that you can help him. You see? I don't know how we got to that point, but the schools are expected now.
You know, it's interesting. I just had a wild thought. I have a lot of wild thoughts. Should we return to segregated education?
Can we what?
Should we return to segregated education?
Oh, now that's a real question.
Well, I think, I don't know
so.
if return is the right word. I think there, as we've been discussing this morning, obviously there are certain aspects of segregated education that turned out for some of us to be beneficial.
Very.
Now, whether we need to think about replicating that, and if it is indeed possible in this day and age, given the external influence that, that's impacting today's student, both minority and non-minority, I think it would be a very difficult challenge to return to segregated education, but it would be more difficult to identify or pinpoint some of the positives that existed in segregated education and replicate that today. And again, it would depend on the degree of receptivity that the student has. What you mentioned, Dr. Lawrence, I assume the student reached out to you, right? You didn't reach out to that student, or was it a combination?
Combination.
Combination. But whatever, it seems as though there has to be some type of linkage, some type of realistic approach on the part of the mentor and the mentee, and explaining what the benefits, reflecting historically on some of the aspects that existed during segregation and segregated schools that turned out to be beneficial for those of us who are in our mature years now.
I'd like to interject just one little thing. The other thing that happened to us, black men and women left the field of education. We don't have enough of us in the field. We abandoned it because we could then, suddenly we could become so many other things. But I think the pandemic has taught us one thing, that in-person, one-on-one contact that children have with teachers is a lot more valuable than a computer. It's coming out. But we need us in the school systems.
Mr. Cook?
Well, I was listening to what you were saying. The reason why a lot of kids are not focused on, like you say, the old type education is because it's computer age.
Yeah.
There's too much technology as far as, they're more interested in technology. I got a granddaughter, and she lives and dies by that computer. And I try to use the computer as well as they do, but they're more into it. I mean, they're really educated as far as the computer, yeah, because that's the age that they grew up in. So
2-year-olds can.
right, I got a 10-year-old granddaughter. I mean, I had to go to her to ask her some of the things that are going on today.
Yes.
So I guess, in a sense, we have to move up and learn what they're learning because they're in a different situation.
Let me challenge that. Are we using that as an excuse not to return to active interpersonal involvement? I understand the reality. I totally understand the reality. But are we using that as a way of justifying non-return to active involvement in the developmental experience of our children?
See, the people in higher powers are the ones who don't want to go back to that old type of education because it was,
All about the money.
it's, correct. It's about the money.
But I do believe, I'm waiting to see, because really their school districts were really challenged with how many, especially in the state of Texas, I haven't looked outside that, but with the gap that was formed during the year in which a majority of students were learning virtually. And they're wrestling with that right now as to, I don't think it's going to take technology out of the schools. But what we do need to look at, and I think some of them will be looking at it, is that technology should supplement, not supplant.
One of the things to keep in mind
Okay.
is that what you each described and what I experienced in early segregated education was combined family teacher activity in behalf of my developmental process, your developmental process. You described a unifying community approach, a unifying approach across academic entities within the segregated school area. You expressed a commitment on the part of the teachers and family for progress in their young people and to represent that family and community system in a positive way in the future. Is there a way to return to that?
Not without a paradigm shift. You can't do it with the mindset we have right now. I don't think. That's an
Yeah, I
opinion.
think it requires a commitment on the part of the student and parents, but the environment has changed. And you have to recognize that those changes can be positive and don't have to be negative. I agree that the parents probably are not as determined and as committed to interacting with teachers and making sure that their students have the education that they need. But why is that? And I think once there's a recognition as to why it exists, and you can break that down, and you can break down some of those barriers that exist now between the teachers and the parents, and try to return to some of the basics that existed a generation ago in our generation. It's difficult because the barriers, as I said, are what we've been talking about, the technology and the social media and the distractions that are out there. And it's just extremely difficult when everyone is wrapped up and totally engaged in social media. It's a whole different environment. It's a whole different world. And we have to see what can be done to get back to some of the basics. But at the same time, it's a difficult challenge to break down some of those barriers.
Those barriers,
Yeah.
that's true. And children learn from each other, too. That's something else. They miss their friends.
That's something that I noticed, and I wish they would bring back into the school system. Learning how to write, penmanship.
Absolutely.
Students,
I agree.
I look at the kids today, they don't know how to.
Oh, they stopped cursive, remember? They took cursive out. If you
look at
sign
their
your
writing
name.
skills, they're horrible.
They only know the keyboard.
Yeah,
And there are teachers who have come through the system already who cannot read cursive writing. I was always being asked, what does this say? But there are some states, Ohio, I don't know about Texas yet, but I know Ohio and Iowa, I believe, have now mandated that they go back and that the school districts begin to teach cursive writing.
How can we as individuals or as members of organizations like the San Antonio African American Museum and Community Archive or United Way or the, how can we become advocates for recognition of these deficit areas and continually at least speak to the need for return to some sense of unity in educational approach for African American children? I'm prejudiced.
You prejudice, okay. Can we, in our organizations, our predominantly African-American organizations, begin to insert a mentoring type program as part of our program facet? Can we focus on that rather than on 1,001 things that we're doing or focusing on? Can we give up some of our pleasurable whatever and put that money and time into the children?
I'm the first African-American in San Antonio ever to be chairman of the board of United Way. I was sitting at the executive committee, which I was on for about 30 years before I stepped down a year or so ago, and I made the following statement. I said, racism is taught during the first 3 years of life at the kitchen table. Now, the room was 95% white. Some of the black staff the next day called me and said, Dr. Lawrence, when you speak, it's like E.F. Hutton. The whole room comes to attention. I said, who in the hell you think taught E.F. Hutton? And what I mean is this. Communication clearly and directly must be manifest at all levels within the African American community in order to become effective advocates for our children. I'm very strong in the belief of that. Am I out there on the limb by myself?
I think that's an accurate statement. It does depend on the receptivity. I mean, you're talking about communication, which means you have an audience. You have someone who's listening, or who's willing to listen, and is willing to try to understand what you want to convey. And I think those are the kind of gaps that we're confronted with right now, is that we can have very serious efforts and attempts at communicating, but if we don't get genuine feedback on that communication, then we tend to think that, well, maybe it's useless. It's not working. It's not working because we're not getting the kind of feedback that we would have gotten 35, 40 years ago in response to what we were trying to convey. And I don't know if that's just a function of the environment, the culture, today's culture that exists, but I agree we have to make every effort and continue to strive, but it's a two-way street.
It's a two-way street.
Yeah, that's my opinion. Anybody else?
Life is interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
If you were a fourth grade teacher at this point in time, what would you want to communicate to your predominantly African American class about racism?
About what?
Racism. About racism. What would you want to communicate to the students in your class? What would you want them to know about the reality of racism?
I think I could take one simple phrase that probably was given to most of us. Until we get to a certain point of what we call social justice, you must be better. You cannot be, at this point, it is not about equal, it's about better. When I see us at the head table, I know that person is 10 times better to have gotten there. So you must be better at this point. Now, we may one day get to that point where we have equality, but we're not there yet.
Any other
I think
thoughts?
that's what we were taught. Most teachers use that phrase as they were trying to prepare us for that next level, because we were all apparently in that range where they knew we were getting ready to go into it. And so they always use that phrase, you must be better. And I know I took that to heart.
Oh, you must be the best.
Huh?
Oh, you must be the best.
Oh, you must be, well, you're going to be, yeah, you're going to be, yeah. But you must be better for whatever. Don't stop at that.
Is it futile?
At the scene.
Is it a futile effort? Is it something that we just shouldn't talk about because it's unreal?
You mean today?
Yeah.
No, I hope not. I mean, one would hope that, as I mentioned earlier, it's a generational thing. Each of today's parents should want the best for their children, as was the case in prior generations. Now, I said should, but I'm not sure that exists right now. It should, and we can say it should because we look at ourselves as beneficiaries of that type of environment. But today's parents and the people who are responsible for the kids today, I'm not sure fully understand what it means to be a serious student and to break away from some of the norms and that exist, some of the peer pressure that exists because of technology and social media. So I don't know how I can answer that question in today's world as opposed in the context of what happened in the past.
How should the organization which is sponsoring what we are doing today present to their constituency the reality of racism, the reality of segregation, the benefits of segregation education, as well as the deficits? How should this organization present these factors to their community recipients?
I'm not sure. I hope that that's a part of their mandate to try to make that type of a connection, but it's a challenge. And realistically, I see students, high school, middle school, and if it's an African-American student, I intentionally mention the fact that I went to Wheatley, and I ask if they know about Wheatley, or if they have any kind of and they can't imagine segregation.
No.
Because it's just not something that's part of their DNA. They don't know what segregation is. Now, they do know that they are in the school systems, that they are put together with students from other nationalities, and that there are differences, but let's put it frankly, they have a choice, and the parents have choices that they didn't have when we were growing up.
Yes.
You were mandated to attend certain schools because of the color of your skin, and that is not the case today.
Anymore. No.
Yeah. Now, to answer your question, I don't know how you can convey what the lessons that were learned from segregation and put that in the context of today's world. I'm not sure.
I listen to my grandkids a lot and thinking back when I was going through stuff. You tell them, they say, "Well, that's old school."
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to be dealing with that kind of stuff. This is my time, and I don't even want to be. Don't even want to hear about it.
Right.
Think about it. So they got told a new agenda, which I guess they're supposed to live their own life as well. But you try to instill in them some of the things that we had to go through and struggle. They don't want to hear it.
My grandchildren are ages 24, 22, 20, 16, and 12, and they have heard everything that I have said today. They have heard it individually. They have heard it collectively. I can't say that they have incorporated it, but they have consistently heard the reality of the world in which they live. My 3 children who are here in San Antonio, one's a pediatrician, one's an anesthesiologist, and the other one's making money. He's a financial analyst and won't give me no money. But they have heard the reality of the world in which they live. They hear it over and over and over again. When my older boy was 4 years old, he was attending a preschool that was all white. And I got home from the office and my wife said, "You got to talk to him." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, a little girl had a toy and he took the toy." And the teacher said, "David, give the toy back," and he put the toy in his mouth. And the teacher reached for the toy and he bit the teacher. And then he put his hands on his little hip and he says, My mother says I'm the only black child here. She says I don't have to do what you say. My wife would not say things like that. I would. So you can see me chastising this kid with him sitting on my lap, and I'm trying to pat him on the back and at the same time caution him. 1 month later, the teacher called and said, I owe you all an apology. I considered him retarded because he did not want to do what we were doing. He already knew it, she discovered. So that is in that teacher's behalf. We must, from my perspective, continue to be open advocates for the developmental process of our children, because racism is real and it's going to confront them. And if they are not able to anticipate the impact, they're going to suffer the consequences.
I think it depends on the
Dr. Lawrence.
circumstances. You mentioned grandkids. I have a grandson who was in school in Denver, And about a year ago, he called. He was doing, his teacher had asked him to do some family research. And he called me and he said, what was it like when you were growing up? Because that's what he had to write in this paper in school. His teacher said, you
Yes.
talk about your family, your grandparents. And he says, the more I told him, the more he was in disbelief.
Yes.
But he was excited to hear
it.
about what the differences were between the environment that I had in school and what he's going through now. And I was excited that he was interested,
Yes.
and that his teacher put the focus on it and made him interested in it and understanding generational differences.
Generational. One of the things we have left out of the equation, we do not have programs that include parents. There are so many problems out there that if our organizations, the schools, whomever, could somehow bring the parents in, a component for parents. Because as long as they're getting one story from the parents and another story from the rest of us or whomever, there's conflict. There's reason to cast it off as, not important, or not to believe it. But we don't have programs. They should begin really with the parents.
We are approaching the time when this session will be ending. And I want to give each of you a couple of minutes to make a summary statement from your perspective, both about the issues that we've discussed today and about other factors, situations, issues that you think might be relevant to the organization that is sponsoring our interaction today. And we will start with you, Ms. Duncan.
Oh my God. This has been a wonderful session. I've enjoyed the conversation. Kind of makes you think back and reminisce and really evaluate in many ways how you reached where you are. Someone invested in you. So I enjoyed doing that today because I do appreciate the investments that were made in me. And I realize how important they are. I would hope that this organization can find a way to include the larger Black community, I think, in what they are doing. Not only from our generation here, the older ones, but also have programming in place for the current generation that's school-age children. Somehow, we need the larger community to gather them together in some way. I don't know how or what they would do with the program, but and then use us as resources as they begin to talk about their problems. I don't know that it's kind of like with the welfare program, the things that they had to stop doing was telling them what they needed to do, but listening to what the clients say they need to do. What are their needs? How can we interact with this population that we're talking about in a way that we get to understand how they feel, what they need, what's missing, because from the outside looking in, we could very well have a different perspective.
I also would like to commend SACAM, the organization, for what it's done, and I think the pathways are infinitesimal. You can choose which way you want to go, and you can choose how you want to use some of the commentary that's come about today, and how that will impact on students and the broader San Antonio community, parents. And I think that's what from what I've heard, that's what you're going to do. And I hope that you're developing a repertoire of information and historical information that can be useful as we try to make decisions moving forward in San Antonio. There's a lot of information out there, but also there's a lot of information sharing that's needed. And I think the efforts that are being put forth with groups like this and seminars like this and presentations can be beneficial in helping to satisfy a thirst, a hunger for information that's needed to understand our path forward. And I congratulate you, and I hope you have much success in your future endeavors and activities that you have planned for the upcoming years. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the organization for inviting me out and being able to give my opinions, and also allowing you to understand some of the things that I had gone through. And you get a different perspective from all three of us, because some of us in all black schools, and I had the opportunity to attend a not totally segregated, but integrated school. And those experiences I had at integrated school actually was a life skill learning for me, because I had to learn the difference between being in the black community versus going to a different interracial situation. And the things that I learned and encountered, then I going back to the same situation that I started at in high school, it helped me to be able to understand the kids that are this generation that I had to teach with. And I kind of gave them a kind of idea exactly what I went through, and gave them an education on integration as far as segregation. I did teach some of that stuff because I wanted them to know some of the things that I encountered. And I cared about these kids, and I have kids today that keeps calling me back, and I made a good friendship with my students. And the teachers today needs to be get closer to the students. And I'm not saying to tell them what they need to be doing, but care about them. And a lot of kids are not being cared about, and I hope that the teaching generation today would be more loving with their kids and try to understand some of the situations that they go through. And again, thank y'all for inviting me, and I've had a good time.
And I want to thank SACAM for allowing me to participate. The day I entered medical school in 1958 in Indianapolis, Indiana, Dean walked up to me, put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Boy, hope the other colored boys have told you we're glad you're here, and that the highest grade you can make in this school is a B." Somebody said, "How'd that make you feel?" I said, "I wanted to kill him." And they said, "Well, why didn't you?" I said, 2 reasons. If I'd have killed him, I'd had to go home and tell my mother, the maid, "Mama, I killed the dean," and she would have killed me. And then when my father, the chauffeur, got home later on that evening, he'd have woke me up from the dead, and he'd have killed me again. So there wasn't no need for me to die twice, for that gentle person to only pass on once. I graduated in 4 years. Highest grade I made was a B. The other thing that happened that same day is that one of my new white classmates comes up and he says, "We've got some of the bark from the tree of the last lynching in the state of Indiana." And I looked at him. He's trying to be nice. I went home and told my father that evening. He said, "Don't ever mention that to your mother." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because one of the 2 people that was lynched in Marion, Indiana in 1930 was your mother's first cousin. My second cousin was the last lynching formal in the state of Indiana." Been through a lot, saw a lot, experienced positive things, experienced negative things. And one of the things I have learned over the years is you can't just sit on it. You got to lay it out there. You got to call it the way you see it. And you really don't care how somebody else is going to respond to it. Reality is reality. And one of the building blocks for the future that each of our children have is the reality upon which their life, their birth, their experiences is built. So with that in mind, we will close this session. And again, thank you very much to SACAM for allowing all of us to participate in this endeavor this morning. Have a good day.